Every time Tom opens his mouth, it reminds me why he has absolutely no business in the X office. This is a man that is very clearly retired on active duty. Unfortunately, we're all going to be the ones that have to suffer as a result.
Yeah, he recently spoke to Adventures in Poor Taste for X-Men Monday, the first time Tom Brevoort has actually talked to them since he took over as the head of X, launching the From the Ashes era. And I must say, I kind of agree with you, Doc. You can just tell by the way that he talks that, one, he doesn't care about X-Men, doesn't know anything about them, but also that he doesn't want the job and he's just doing it because they told him to.
When it was leading into it and he was having some interviews, his lack of interest was palpable. He had exactly zero investment in the X line. He had zero interest in doing it. Us as the consumer have spent the last few months at the bare minimum being forced to deal with his lack of interest.
This is what Brevoort talked about learning about X-Men over the past 5 months since From the Ashes started. He stated, "I didn't assume I knew anything about X-Men. I watched it all from afar, and I certainly read the books back when I was just a reader, and I've kept up with them on and off during my Marvel tenure. So I wasn't a stranger, but I also wasn't enmeshed in that world. It's very different than running the Avengers books, or what we used to call the Marvel Heroes books. Part of that is, for the most part, when it was time to launch a new Iron Man series, I didn't have to care much about what was going on in Captain America, and I had to care a little bit, but not that much, about what was going on in Avengers. These were intended as individual solo titles that all had a common hub, which was Avengers, kind of complaining about the fact that when you're the head of X, you actually have to pay attention to the entire line because things are going to connect a little bit more. And you definitely get the feeling that he's not happy that he's having to potentially work harder than he used to.
He recognizes, and he's at least making the admission that he accepts that X-Men is not Avengers. And it doesn't work the same way as Avengers. And it doesn't operate, you can't run it the same way as you do Avengers. And then promptly spends most of the article talking about how he's trying to run it exactly the way he ran Avengers. Except for he has to do a little extra work because otherwise people get mad at him for failing to keep track of even what the fuck is going on from book to book, because it doesn't seem like he's terribly interested in even reading the ones that he's coordinating.
Absolutely. It's kind of strange that you would think, he's been in charge for 5 months. He's been in place probably longer than, I would say, closer to 8 months, getting the team together, getting the launch ready and everything. Upwards of getting close to a year at this point. The fact that he didn't learn like one lesson that's helped him out along the way, or one mistake that was made, I would have brought up the QR codes. You and I have worked I worked in government world. You worked in corporate world for a long time. It's pretty easy to come up with something that you've learned in the last 8 months. But he clearly hasn't learned shit.
And he doesn't seem terribly interested in learning anything either. Just repeating the same mistakes over and over and over and expecting different results. Well, not even accepting that they're mistakes. Is it an admission of insanity? I don't know. I mean, it's definitely an admission that he's fucking retarded. He does not give any shits. It speaks through the page, through his attitudes and lack of self-awareness, lack of reflection, that he really does not give a good goddamn about anything that's being done here.
Yeah, and you can definitely see it in the comic books that are coming out. They've basically been across the board kind of terrible. But we've gotten a lot of solo books that are talking about that. Maybe there is more strength in having 5 different characters in a book, so the fans of all 5 will show up to check it out or whatnot. But I find that a lot harder and a lot more difficult to create legitimate reasons for these particular characters to all be doing some mission together that's not exactly like the mission these other 5 characters are doing over here. It's a lot easier to focus in on solo players and go, okay, what is Psylocke about? What's the tone of the character and how can we make that different from the other books in the line? What ground does she stand on? What history does she have? What conflicts relate to her differently than they relate to Magic, Phoenix, or Storm? Once again saying, yeah, I'm doing the solo books because quite frankly, they're easier to manage.
This is a man that has zero interest in going outside of his comfort zone. Instead, he just wants to do exactly what he did on Avengers, which is having a single character with a bunch of not really co-stars, but like an ensemble cast that he doesn't have to really care about because most of them don't really matter. And they don't have to maintain any sort of, I guess, be on model, both visually and personality wise. They don't have to stick to anything. Instead, he would rather just do solo books where what happens in Psylocke doesn't really affect anything in any other book. He doesn't have to think of unique stories. And that's the reason why a number of these solo books have felt like they're telling the exact same story.
So while I was in the Air Force, obviously I was there for a long time. I am retired, proudly retired military, 20 plus years of service in the United States Air Force. We did have a saying, work smarter, not harder. And I'm all for that strategy. If you can find ways that are more efficient, more effective to get your job done, then I say you should definitely use them. Yep. But just hitting an easy button that doesn't really work within the confines of the job that you have because you don't want to put in the work, that's not working smarter. That's working lazier, not harder. He's being more lazy than efficient in his use of solo characters because he doesn't want to have to tie things in. And he's not very good, apparently, with conflict, which you think he would be great at with the Avengers. You go read the X-Force book, the one X-Men team that almost feels like an X-Men book. What's it lacking? Character dynamics, interpersonal conflict, relationships being established and kind of torn apart and all that kind of stuff. There's no fun to be had in the book. They just go to another place and they shoot.
Any sort of, I guess you could say, interpersonal conflict might piss off the weird shippers that Marvel is courting with their books, and that the X-Men, especially in the Krakoan and post-Krakoan era, that is their entire audience, is people that are just obsessed with who's fucking who. And so people actually getting into arguments and fights and everything is antithetical to that audience because they just want people to fuck, really, and kiss each other, regardless of the fact that absolutely nobody else wants that.
Speaking of that, that's another topic that he kind of chimed in on, making Kitty Pryde canonically bisexual. He said, from my point of view, and from the point of view of pretty much everybody up here, including the creators, we didn't see this as a big deal. Like you say, we kind of saw it as fait accompli. There are enough scenes and enough moments. People have been talking about this since forever, and I think e-viewing very much plays it and played it just like a thing that's always been there. Nobody comments on it. It's not a big deal. It's just a character living your life, and I like that. I like the fact that it's just a fact of life and an ordinary thing, and that's fine. And none of it negates any of the stuff that came before. I have a hard time believing that they didn't think it was a big deal, considering they leaked it out to the 3 or 4 media sites out there, so they would cover it and say, yes, Kitty Pryde is canonically gay, even though that had already happened, 5 years prior, because they obviously did think it was a big deal.
They could pretend like, oh, we're not making a big deal about it. No, they're not, because they trusted their lackeys in what passes for a comic book media these days to do it for them. Just because you don't do the legwork on your propaganda doesn't mean the propaganda didn't happen. It just happened through IO9 and Screen Rant and, comicbook.com and fucking Jezebel.
And of course, he does call the moment fait accompli, which means a thing that's already happened or been decided before those affected hear about it, leaving them with no option but to accept it, because we have no choice in it, Doc. We're just in the grasp of Marvel Comics. We just have to accept anything, but then also says it negates nothing, but you have to accept it.
Nothing is different. Everything's exactly the same, but accept it now, bitches. Might as well be the motto of the literary rapist. But sure, yeah, whatever, Tom. We just have to accept it because you say that that's the case now.
Well, because there were slight hints throughout the last 40 years, Doc, that maybe she liked to tickle other girls, even though she's actually only been in relationships with men.
And what it comes down to is weirdo, sex-obsessed freaks don't understand the concept of friendship. So every time 2 women happen to be friendly, not even like best friends, but just friendly with one another, it absolutely is 100% proof positive that they are also fucking each other. Even though Kitty has never displayed any, I guess you could say, sexual interest in another woman. Well, god damn, she's been friends with women. So I guess
Proof enough for me.
Yep, she wants to fuck them. And that's who has now populated the X-Men fan base and the X-Men writers room and the X-Men editorial department. And it's
I don't think
very,
they've actually
very
populated the fan base. I think they're the ones that talk about how much they like it on social media but don't pay for it.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
a reason sales aren't doing great. And I think it's just another example of Tom Brevoort having his own head shoved directly up his own ass and believing that he just gets to dictate everything. The final thing we'll talk about, because I think it's really stupid, he talks about resurrection-linked degenerative sickness, one of the new things that's been introduced. And he says, by its nature, it almost has to have a wider effect than just adjectiveless X-Men. It has to be a thing that's in play across the line for potentially any person who went through Krakoa and Resurrection. I had our Marvel Handbook team do a deep dive in to get me a full comprehensive list of who was resurrected because I asked Jordan D. White for it, and he said they didn't keep track of it. So we had to put some experts on the case, and I'm sure we'll screw it up somewhere because we always screw it up somewhere. Well, at least he's admitting he's an absolute fuck up and throwing Jordan White underneath the bus, going like he didn't even fucking pay attention to any of this stuff. Resurrection-linked degenerative sickness is the dumbest thing in the history of the world. That's the reason Magneto apparently is wheelchair-bound because he was resurrected, and he's not at full strength.
Par for the course in 2020 X Office. Jordan failed to do basic editorial change tracking. Change tracking and archival is absolutely 100% on brand to that hipster fucking doofus. These people are utterly incompetent and fail regularly at basic foundational aspects of their job. Do I hate the idea of the regenerative deteriorating whatever disease? They could have done that during the fucking Krakoan era.
As far as I know, every mutant's been resurrected. Every single one of them would be suffering from it.
Do I hate the idea of adding consequences to their LOL respawn approach of removing the stakes and then still trying to sell us comic based on, oh my god, somebody might die in this issue? Do I like the idea of adding some consequences to that? Sure. Is it too little too late? Abso-fucking-lutely. The whole thing is kind of dumb that they waited this long in order for the consequences to start showing up. This entire article, and I do recommend people go read it to go see how absolutely stupid the brain trust in the X office is these days. It amounted to nothing more than, we don't really give a shit. We don't care. I'm not going to learn any lessons. I'm going to keep doing things the way I've been doing them. Yeah, this is just what you're going to have to live with. And even he, like right at the beginning of this, kind of admitted they don't have a solution. They are just throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. They have zero expectations of any of their comics lasting beyond essentially miniseries or maxi series level before needing to go back to the reboot well. That they are just throwing wave after wave after wave of books at the reader. They have essentially baked into the entire launch schedule a failure expectation for every single one of these books.
Yep. And if I were C.B. Cebulski and I was taking the X-Men office out on a field trip to go see the Smithsonian or something like that, I would get a short bus. I would make sure everyone had helmets. And I would probably put them on leashes. That's how dumb these fucking people are. They're basically non-functioning human beings at this point.
It's a true and kind of gross admission of how little not CB Smolsky, the human Bucky's logo doesn't really learn anything and hasn't really had any interest in learning anything. Instead, he will continue to sell you the same shit over and over and expect for you to simultaneously accept all of his changes and then also tell you that none of them were changes at the same time. Yeah. Fuck him.
Absolutely. I do want to say thank you very much to Doc for joining me today to talk about Tom Brevoort opening up about X-Men and just how bad it is getting and certainly is going to become. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. The man is completely clueless. If you like what we're doing here, this was actually filtered down and edited for YouTube. You can get the entire conversation as well as our entire unedited review of Exceptional X-Men number 3 on the Patreon. There's a link in the video description. Doc Unfiltered. You also get the Doc Q&A. You also get the Hot or Not show with Jim, the Geek Fix with Aaron Sparrow, the Comics Guilds with Nick Weiser, and all that fun stuff. Hope to see you at the Patreon very, very soon.